It was on one extraordinary evening that a series of unforeseen events set in motion a tale of error, passion, and hilarious misunderstandings, one that would forever alter the lives of those involved. In the quiet hours before midnight at the renowned Ocean View Retreat, a luxurious resort nestled along a breathtaking coastline, an unusual twist of fate was unfolding. Alina, a meticulous and fiercely independent executive assistant, had been employed by the formidable and enigmatic Edward Kensington, a self-made tycoon known for his icy demeanor and uncompromising work ethic. The night had begun with the promise of celebration, a reward for sealing a monumental deal with visionary tech investors, and ended with both humor and a pinch of scandal that neither party could have foreseen. From the very outset, Elena had known that working for Edward would be no ordinary experience. His reputation for stern efficiency was well known, and his penetrating gaze could silence a room as surely as the stillness before a storm. Yet, on this particular night, the atmosphere was transformed. The normally austere executive had shed his usual reserve, indulging in laughter, witty banter, and even moments of heartfelt amusement. Edward, who normally exuded an air of absolute control, was now seen laughing boisterously and making jocular remarks that belied his usual unyielding exterior. "Even you can let your hair down tonight, Elena," he had remarked with an uncharacteristic twinkle in his eye, an invitation to relax that was as unexpected as it was disarming. The evening's festivities took place in an upscale beachfront restaurant where the ambient sounds of gentle waves mingled with soft music and the low hum of conversation among successful business magnates. At their table, laden with the finest vintages and gourmet delicacies, both Elena and Edward surrendered to the magic of the night. Each sip of expensive wine seemed to erase the rigidity of their daily lives. Edward, who had never before been seen in such a state of revelry, gulped down his glass with an energy that shocked even his own inner reserves. Elena, always attentive to his demands and moods, found herself equally swept up in the unexpected warmth that now radiated from her boss. Their exchange of playful jibes grew into a spontaneous contest, a battle of wits and wine, in which the rules of formality were momentarily forgotten. As the hours passed, the formalities of the evening gave way to a carefree revelry. What began as a professional celebration slowly morphed into a contest of endurance, a challenge of who could outlast the other in consuming the luxurious wine. Edward's usual measured tones were replaced by hearty laughter and offhand compliments that caught Elena entirely by surprise. "Incredible," he had said after a particularly lavish toast, to which Elena teasingly retorted, "I never imagined a man of your stature could ever harbor such a hidden warmth." Edward, with a half-smile and a spark of mischief in his eyes, replied, "And I never thought that you, Miss Elena, could ever let go of your usual guarded self." Their banter was light and full of underlying tension, a tension that, unbeknownst to both, would soon escalate into a series of events that defied all expectation. Eventually, as the wine flowed and inhibitions dissolved, Edward abruptly declared his intention to retire to his private quarters for the night. "I'm heading to my room," he announced, rising from his seat with an assured air that belied the night's earlier levity. His departure was as swift as it was inevitable, leaving behind a trail of laughter and murmured remarks from the surrounding diners. Elena, still buoyed by the effects of the celebration, lingered a while longer in the restaurant. The combination of the heady blend of vintage wine, the soothing caress of the ocean breeze, and the freedom of a work-free evening had loosened her normally steadfast self-control, making her unaware of how far the night's events might soon lead her. After some time, with her senses already dulled and her steps growing unsteady, Elena decided it was time to call it a night. "I'll just get to my room, remove my shoes, and surrender to sleep," she mumbled to herself as she staggered along the lavish corridor of the resort. However, fate had another twist in store. In her inebriated state, the numbers on the closed doors seemed to dance and blur, as if mocking her inability to navigate the labyrinthine hallways of the sprawling resort. Muttering to herself in exasperation about the strange fonts and shifting digits, she suddenly noticed one door ajar. A small gap in the otherwise pristine rows of doors that lined the corridor. With a bemused smile and a quiet, "Thank you, universe," Elena pushed the door open, stepping into what she assumed was her room. The space exuded an inviting warmth, a neatly arranged interior with plush carpeting and a bed that looked as though it were carved out of the softest cloud. Without a second thought, she kicked off her shoes, abandoned her bag in a corner, and threw herself onto the sumptuous bed, sighing with relief and contentment in that moment of bliss. As the cool linen caressed her skin, she whispered, "This is the best hotel ever," before drifting off into a deep, untroubled sleep. Yet, as fate would have it, Elena had entered the wrong room. The following morning, the quiet solitude of dawn was shattered by an unexpected disturbance. Edward Kensington awoke abruptly, disturbed by an unfamiliar presence stirring in his bed. For a moment he thought it might be a strange, lingering dream, a trick of his exhausted mind. But as he peered closer, he noted an impossibility. A living, breathing person was nestled beside him, their chest rising and falling with a serenity that was as perplexing as it was alarming. Could it be my pillow breathing? Or perhaps, does my pillow now possess hair? He wondered in a dazed internal monologue, as his heart pounded with incredulity. Before Edward could process the situation further, Elena began to stir. The serene ambience of Edward's meticulously arranged room was now invaded by the soft, uncoordinated movements of a woman emerging from deep sleep. With a languid stretch and a murmured exclamation praising the luxurious comfort of the bed, Elena seemed entirely oblivious to the chaos of the situation. Yet, as her eyes slowly opened to the unfamiliar surroundings, a room with distinct curtains, a carpet of a hue entirely different from what she remembered, and an unsettling silence, the truth began to dawn upon her. It was then that she noticed the physical presence of Edward, his expression a mix of bewilderment and quiet amusement, as if trying to reconcile the surreal circumstances. Her initial shock swiftly gave way to panic. Elena bolted upright, her heart racing and her mind a whirlwind of disbelief. "What are you doing in my room?" she screamed, her voice trembling with both fear and indignation. Edward, still struggling to comprehend the situation himself, responded with a groggy sigh. "Elena, this is my room," he stated in a calm yet firm tone, rubbing his face in a futile attempt to erase the remnants of last night's intoxication from his mind. For a long moment, Elena's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. The unfamiliar decor, the pristine suit folded perfectly on a chair, and slowly the horrifying realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. "Oh no. Oh yes," she murmured, a rush of heat surging up her neck as the truth sank in. She had unwittingly trespassed into the wrong room. As her face flushed scarlet with embarrassment, Edward crossed his arms and fixed her with an appraising, almost analytical gaze, as though she were a malfunctioning piece of intricate machinery. "It appears you have indeed made an error," he remarked dryly, "but I trust you did not do this intentionally?" Elena's words tumbled out in a mixture of defensive protest and panicked justification. She stuttered an apology, the sound of her voice barely audible while Edward maintained his critical scrutiny. After a moment of tense silence, he inquired in a measured tone, "Answer me one thing. Do you remember anything from last night?" A chill ran down Elena's spine at the question, and for a heartbeat, she was struck dumb. "Depends. What do you mean by anything?" she finally managed to reply, her tone wavering between confusion and anxiety. Edward, still piecing together the fragmented memories of his own indulgence from the night before, offered a peculiar observation. "You woke up smiling, as if you had experienced the most exquisite sleep of your life." The comment hit Elena like a wave of dread and disbelief. "I what?" she stammered, her mind racing as she tried to reconcile his words with the haze of her own recollections. The morning unfolded in a series of awkward silences and furtive glances. Elena, now aware of the gravity of her mistake, hastily began gathering her scattered belongings. With her hair in disarray and her once pristine composure now in tatters, she resolved to leave immediately and erase the embarrassing incident from her memory. "This never happened," she murmured to herself, determination mingling with panic. "No one will ever know, and I will be gone before anyone has a chance to talk." Yet fate, as always, had other plans. At that very moment, a sharp knock sounded at the door, a knock that sent a jolt of terror through her already trembling frame. "Mr. Kensington?" came a bright, familiar voice from the other side. The sound froze both Edward and Elena in their tracks. Elena's face paled as she realized the knock could only mean that their secret was at risk of being exposed. Edward's eyes flickered with a mix of irritation and concern, and he swiftly instructed in a low, urgent tone. "Hide!" Elena's heart pounded as she stammered. "What? Where?" Edward's reply was curt. "Now, behind the couch." "No, that's too obvious. In the closet, perhaps?" With little time to deliberate, and with a hint of resigned panic, Elena obeyed. In a flurry of disjointed movements, she crawled into the narrow confines beneath the bed just as the door swung open to reveal a striking figure, Natalie, a vivacious co-worker known for her perceptiveness and unfiltered candor. "Good morning, Mr. Kensington," Natalie chirped, stepping into the room with a radiant smile that belied the early hour. "I'm sorry to disturb you so soon, but I couldn't help noticing that you look rather different today." Her tone, though light-hearted, carried an undercurrent of curiosity. Edward, still in a state of disarray from the previous night's events, responded in his customary flat tone. "Different how?" Natalie hesitated briefly before remarking, "It seems as though you didn't sleep well. Perhaps it's just the lighting, though I suspect there's something more to it." Before Edward could offer a further explanation, Natalie mentioned that breakfast was ready, leaving the room with an ambiguous farewell and a curious note about Elena's whereabouts. "By the way, have you seen Elena? She seemed to vanish after dinner and I thought she might have been with you." Edward, still occupied with processing the night's calamity, replied with a measured firmness. "No, I haven't seen Elena." The mystery deepened as Natalie departed, leaving behind a silence that was both heavy and expectant. Once the door had closed behind Natalie, Elena emerged from her hiding place with trembling urgency. Her hair remained wild, and her expression was a portrait of sheer panic and mortification. "This is a nightmare," she thought, her mind racing with the implications of the morning's events. "I must get out of here and pretend this never happened." Clutching her shoes tightly as if they were a talisman against the unfolding disaster, she resolved to retreat to her own quarters, to erase the memory of the night and reclaim her dignity. As she hurried through the labyrinthine corridors of the resort, Elena's pace was frantic, her eyes darting in every direction in search of a safe haven where she might regroup. The once familiar hallways now appeared alien, distorted by the lingering effects of her inebriation and the surreal events of the previous night. Every turn, every shadow seemed to mock her with the promise of further embarrassment. Her internal monologue became a desperate litany of two immutable objectives. First, to reach her own room without detection, and second, to convince herself and anyone who might question her that the night before was nothing more than a figment of a wild, drunken imagination. Yet destiny was not finished testing her resolve. As she rounded a corner into the main hallway, her path collided with that of Natalie once again. "Elena!" Natalie called out, her voice loud and unreserved, as if to jolt her friend out of her panic. The sudden encounter startled Elena, and she struggled to muster a semblance of composure in the face of her friend's probing gaze. "Hi, Natalie," she managed to say, attempting a casual tone despite the turmoil churning inside her. "What are you doing here so early?" Natalie's eyes sparkled with a mixture of concern and mild amusement as she replied, "Early? It's nearly 10 in the morning and you disappeared last night. Where were you?" The question struck Elena like a physical blow, and for a brief moment her mind went blank. Desperation clawed at her throat, and her words tumbled out in a frantic, disjointed confession. I slept," she said, her voice trailing off as Natalie's skeptical gaze bore into her. Natalie's expression shifted into one of incredulous doubt. "Really?" she inquired sharply, noting the disarray of Elena's hair, the rumpled state of her clothes, and the haunted look in her eyes. "Because you look as though you've seen a ghost." Elena forced a nervous laugh in response, trying to cover the raw panic that surged within her. "Yeah, it was a rough night of sleep," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Natalie's suspicion, however, only grew. "I'm almost certain that you were with Mr. Kensington," she stated, her tone carrying both certainty and concern. The mere mention of Edward's name sent a jolt of terror through Elena. "What? Why would you think that?" she demanded, her eyes wide with disbelief. Natalie's reply was measured and cool. "Because I happened to visit his room a few minutes ago, and something about the way he was acting was off, as if he were trying to hide something." A cold sweat broke out along Elena's spine, as she struggled to reconcile the implications of Natalie's words with her own hazy recollections. The conversation between the two women grew tense as Natalie pressed gently for further details. but Elena could only muster vague denials and feeble explanations. In that surreal moment, the glamorous facade of the Ocean View retreat had crumbled away to reveal the raw, unpolished vulnerability of a night gone horribly awry. With each passing second, the reality of her mistake loomed larger, casting long shadows over what had begun as a night of triumph and celebration. Desperate to regain control over her unraveling life, Elena made a swift decision. "I must go back to my own room," she insisted, her voice trembling with a mix of resolve and dread. "I need to forget all of this ever happened and start over." Natalie, still watching her with a wary, empathetic look, simply nodded, leaving Elena to her own devices as she hurried away into the unknown corridors of the resort. Every step Elena took seemed to echo with the irony of the situation. A night intended for relaxation and celebration had instead become an elaborate farce, a labyrinth of errors and misadventures. Her mind, already clouded by the remnants of intoxication, struggled to process the series of events, the unexpected intimacy, the mistaken identity of her room, the curious interlude with a man whose stern exterior had been momentarily softened by the night's festivities, and now the looming confrontation with her own conscience. She clutched her room key like a lifeline, determined to escape the chaotic memories that threatened to engulf her. As the morning light filtered softly through the resort's corridors, casting gentle shadows that danced along the polished floors, Elena's internal battle waged on. She yearned to reclaim her dignity, to dissolve the overwhelming shame that clung to her every thought. Yet, deep inside, she knew that this night would forever be etched in her memory. A reminder that even in the most meticulously planned lives, the unpredictable hand of fate could always intervene. In that silent, reflective moment, the elegant halls of the Ocean View retreat transformed into a stage for a drama that was as ironic as it was poignant. Elena's determined stride, her desperate attempt to reclaim a semblance of normalcy, served as a stark counterpoint to the chaotic laughter and whispered secrets of the night before. And while her every step was fraught with anxiety and the ghost of a mistake that might never be undone, there remained a glimmer of hope. A hope that one day, the strange tapestry of that fateful night might be woven into the narrative of her life as a lesson in humility, resilience, and the unpredictability of human connections. As she disappeared into the labyrinth of corridors, leaving behind the echoes of that surreal morning, Elena's heart pounded with the promise of renewal. The night's events, as disastrous and confounding as they seemed, would eventually become nothing more than a curious chapter in her life. A chapter that she might one day recall with a bittersweet smile. And so, with a mix of trepidation and determination, she embraced the uncertainty of her future, ready to move forward while silently vowing to herself that the mistakes of the past would never again dictate the course of her destiny. Elena's heart still pounded from the early morning revelations as she tried to regain her composure. The soft murmur of conversation in the hotel corridor gave way to a lingering tension that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. As she and Isabella continued their tentative walk toward breakfast, the details of the previous night began to blur into a surreal haze. "Are you sure you're all right?" Isabella inquired, in a tone that mingled genuine concern with a slight hint of playful teasing. "Because you seem rather on edge," she added, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she searched Elena's face for an explanation. "I am not nervous," Elena retorted sharply, though her voice betrayed a quaver that she could not quite hide. "It's just that hunger has a way of making one irritable," she explained, attempting to smooth over the unease that had built inside her. Isabella's lips curved into a small, understanding smile. "Oh, that does make sense," she conceded, and with that, the tension between them began to dissipate just a fraction. Elena felt the pressure ease from her shoulders as she nearly collapsed in relief at the simple human connection of the moment. Barely holding herself together, she managed a shaky smile. "All right then, can we have breakfast now?" she pleaded, her voice soft but earnest. Isabella, ever the energetic companion, promptly took hold of Elena's arm and guided her down the long, opulent hallway of the Azure Coast Resort. The corridor was adorned with artful sculptures and warm ambient lighting that contrasted starkly with the storm of thoughts racing through Elena's mind. Once they arrived at the breakfast hall, they chose a table near the expansive balcony that overlooked the endless blue of the ocean. The air was redolent with the tantalizing aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the inviting scent of warm pastries. Normally, Elena would have savored the beauty of the moment, the gentle clink of cutlery, the soft hum of conversation, and the idyllic view beyond. But her thoughts were fixated elsewhere. Even as she tried to push them aside, she found herself glancing furtively at Edward Kensington, who was seated a few tables ahead, engaged in animated conversation with two influential investors. His appearance was immaculate, every detail of his tailored suit and carefully groomed hair radiating a sense of unwavering professionalism. There was not even a trace of the disarray that marked his waking moments just hours before, when he had discovered an unexpected guest in his private quarters. "Hey, you're staring at Edward rather strangely," Isabella remarked with a half-teasing, half-concerned tone. Elena nearly sputtered a gulp of coffee in response. "I'm not staring," she insisted, although her eyes betrayed her unease. "Then why does your hand tremble as you hold your cup?" Isabella countered gently, placing her own cup on the table as if to punctuate her point. "I'm just tense because of today's meetings," she offered, nodding as if to convince herself as much as Elena. Yet, Elena's inner thoughts raced faster than her words. She was acutely aware that the precarious balance of events might collapse at any moment. After breakfast, the resort's large conference room beckoned. Today's event was critical, a final round of negotiations preceding a major merger that could redefine the futures of both companies. Elena tried to focus on the meticulously prepared documents in front of her, but every time she lifted her eyes, she found Edward's gaze meeting hers from across the room. It was as though he were silently communicating an unspoken message. "I know you haven't forgotten what happened." Each glance sent a shiver down her spine, and with every tilt of his head, his expression suggested that he was thoroughly amused by the chaos the previous night had wrought. Unable to ignore his presence any longer, Edward finally broke the silence during a discussion of share allocations. "Elena, could you review these reports for me?" he said, his tone smooth and professional, yet carrying an undercurrent of something more, a playful gleam that suggested he was enjoying their current predicament far too much. Elena's grip tightened on her pen as she fought to maintain a semblance of control. "Yes, Mr. Kensington," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. As he offered her a barely perceptible smile, she felt a chilling certainty that he intended to keep the memory of their accidental intimacy alive for the foreseeable future. When the meeting eventually concluded, Elena attempted to slip away unnoticed. But as fate would have it, before she could reach the door, Edward's firm voice halted her escape. "Miss Elena, could you join me for a moment?" he requested. Her heart sank, and her pulse quickened as she paused in the doorway, hesitating with both dread and resignation. Isabella cast her a curious look, murmuring softly, "Tell me what that was about later." With little choice, Elena followed Edward into a more secluded part of the resort. He led her into a private room, where he closed the door behind them, turning slowly to face her with an expression that was as inscrutable as it was commanding. "We need to talk," he said, his voice measured and calm. Elena crossed her arms defensively. "If this is about what happened this morning, know that I am already doing everything in my power to pretend it never happened," she declared, her tone edged with desperation. Edward's smile was slight, almost knowing. "I noticed," he admitted quietly. Then, with a deliberate lean forward, he continued, "The problem is, I haven't forgotten." His words twisted in her stomach like a sharp, unwelcome reminder of the night before. "What do you mean by that?" Elena managed to ask, her voice a fragile whisper in the charged silence. Edward's eyes searched hers intently. "Do you really think that if we simply ignore the incident, it will simply vanish from memory?" he queried, his tone laced with incredulity. "Yes," she murmured in reply, almost as a reflex, though the truth of her feelings remained clouded by fear and uncertainty. "That is unfortunate," he observed dryly, "because now that you have inadvertently entered my room, imagine what people will say if the truth comes to light." Elena's heart pounded harder as she tensed, her face paling. "No one must ever know," she pleaded, her voice quivering as she tried to reassure herself more than him. Edward crossed his arms in a gesture that was at once both protective and accusatory. "Then I suggest you do everything within your power to ensure that no one grows suspicious," he warned. His words carried the weight of a threat, though tempered by a smirk that belied any real "That sounds like a threat," Elena murmured, her tone a blend of indignation and disbelief. "No, Elena," Edward replied coolly, his eyes gleaming with a mix of amusement and determination. Consider it merely a reminder." The air between them thickened with tension as she inhaled deeply, trying to steady her racing heart. "Do you want something from me?" she finally asked, her voice tentative as she searched for clarity in his unreadable expression. He regarded her for what felt like an eternity before answering. "I want your cooperation," he stated plainly. Elena's mind raced. She had no idea what sort of cooperation he expected from her, yet something in his unwavering gaze told her that this matter was far from resolved. She left the room with her heart pounding in her ears, her mind reeling with the implications of Edward's words. What did he mean by cooperation? And why did he seem so unnervingly calm while she teetered on the edge of a meltdown? As she walked slowly through the elegantly lit corridors of the resort, she tried desperately to clear her thoughts before meeting Isabella for lunch. In her mind, she repeated her silent mantra: stay natural, remain composed, and act as if nothing were amiss. Yet deep inside, she knew that nothing was truly under control. Upon entering the resort's stylish restaurant for lunch, Elena found Isabella already seated at a table by the window, cheerfully waving her over. Forcing a smile, Elena approached with hesitant steps. "You took forever," she teased lightly, masking the underlying tension. Isabella's eyes twinkled with curiosity as she poured herself some salad dressing. "What did Edward want to talk about?" she asked, her tone casual yet laced with concern. Elena paused for a moment, then offered a dismissive shrug. "Nothing much, just some work details," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Isabella raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Right," she murmured. "If that's all, then why do you look as if you've seen a ghost?" Elena let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the heavy burden of her thoughts. "I'm just tired, that's all," she insisted, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking reassurance. But as she resumed eating, she couldn't shake the sensation of someone watching her. She glanced up to see Edward seated a few tables away, discreetly observing her while engaging in a hushed conversation with another influential businessman. His gaze was sharp and calculating, as if he were silently monitoring her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to make his next move. A sudden chill ran down her spine as she realized that he was testing her. With her mind racing, she forced herself to look away, concentrating instead on the food before her. Determined to maintain the facade of calm, she resolved to ignore the unsettling scrutiny. Yet after lunch, as she returned to her room to review the reports in preparation for the evening cocktail event, the steady pulse of anxiety refused to subside. No sooner had she settled into her chair than the room phone began to ring, a shrill, insistent sound that made her pause mid-sentence. Hesitating only briefly, she answered, "Hello?" In a low, firm tone that brooked no argument, Edward's voice came through the receiver. "Come to the terrace." Before she could gather her thoughts or respond, he abruptly ended the call, leaving her with a heavy sense of foreboding. Staring at the now silent phone, her stomach churned with apprehension. Something was decidedly wrong. With a resigned sigh, she rose from her desk and made her way to the resort's terrace. There, leaning casually against the polished railing and gazing out at the vast, shimmering ocean, was Edward. He did not immediately turn to face her. Instead, he continued to stare at the horizon, as though he were meticulously choosing his words before speaking. Finally, his voice cut through the silence. "Are you hiding something from me, Elena?" he asked, his tone both inquisitive and probing. Elena's brows furrowed as she crossed her arms in a defensive gesture. "What do you mean by that?" she replied, her voice uncertain. After a long pause, Edward finally turned, his gaze intense and analytical as it swept over her. "I mean that since this morning you have been avoiding me, as though you have committed a transgression that you cannot confess." Elena scoffed, attempting to dismiss his insinuations. "I'm not avoiding you," she said, her tone edged with a mixture of irritation and defiance. "I'm merely trying to avoid a scandal that could ruin us both." At this, Edward's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening slightly. "That is interesting," he murmured, leaning in as if to emphasize his next words. "Because now the investors are growing curious about us." Elena's stomach sank as she tried to process his words. "What do you mean?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward's reply was measured and chillingly direct. "A rumor is circulating that we spent the night together," he stated, his tone void of any attempt at humor. The shock in Elena's expression was palpable. "What? But how?" "Someone saw you leaving my room this morning," she exclaimed, the realization sending another jolt of fear through her body. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she wondered aloud, "Who?" Edward merely crossed his arms once more and replied, "It doesn't matter who. What matters is that now the investors believe there is a connection between us, and, surprisingly, that notion is working in our favor." For a long, heavy moment, silence reigned as Elena struggled to comprehend the implications of his words. "What do you mean by working in our favor?" she finally inquired, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Edward exhaled slowly, as though explaining an obvious truth. "The Callahan Group, the investors we are currently negotiating with, place immense value on stability and trust in business partnerships. Now that they perceive us as a couple, they are far more inclined to finalize the deal," he explained, his tone both pragmatic and almost dismissive of the emotional chaos unfolding between them. Elena blinked several times, feeling as if the ground beneath her was shifting. "That is absurd," she murmured, yet the cold facts before her left little room for disagreement. After a brief, heavy pause, Edward's voice took on a softer, more conciliatory tone. "So, what exactly do I require of you?" he asked, his gaze searching hers for any sign of resistance. "I want you to play the part of my girlfriend for the remainder of our stay," he said bluntly, as if reciting the terms of a business contract rather than a personal request. Elena choked on her next words, barely managing to gasp. "You're asking me to pretend to be your girlfriend in front of these investors?" His response was a matter-of-fact nod accompanied by a half-smile that conveyed both assurance and inevitability. "Yes, exactly as you heard," he confirmed, his tone leaving no room for debate. The absurdity of the situation nearly overwhelmed her. "This is utterly crazy," Elena said with a nervous laugh, struggling to balance the surreal nature of the demand with the gravity of their professional circumstances. Edward's expression remained unperturbed, his eyes filled with a calm determination. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but you want this merger to go through, do you not?" Elena's mouth opened in protest, but no convincing argument came forth. The weight of responsibility and the stark reality that the future of Ford Enterprises and her own career hung in the balance silenced her. Taking a step forward, Edward continued, "It need not be an elaborate charade. A few joint appearances, some shared dinners, and a few well-placed strategic smiles should suffice. Once the deal is sealed, we shall go our separate ways and never speak of this again." Elena's head spun as she absorbed his words. "You're asking me to stage a fake relationship in front of a group of high-stakes investors?" she repeated, her tone a mixture of incredulity and reluctant acceptance. A part of her, darkly curious despite the peril of the situation, wondered where this bizarre arrangement might ultimately lead. "If I comply, the contract will be signed, and no one will ever have to know about that disastrous morning in your room," Edward asserted, his voice firm and resolute. The magnitude of the decision pressed down on Elena as she considered her options. With a deep, shuddering breath, she finally conceded, "Fine, but understand this. This masquerade ends as soon as we return home." Edward's smile broadened, a spark of triumph glinting in his eyes as he replied, "Perfect." For a brief moment the tension between them seemed to ease, replaced by an uneasy truce born of mutual necessity. Yet as Elena walked away, the reality of the dangerous territory into which she had just stepped weighed heavily on her. She felt as though she were teetering on the edge of a precipice, caught between her own principles and the relentless demands of corporate survival. Every step down the polished corridors of the Azure Coast Resort reverberated with the knowledge that she was about to engage in the most audacious performance of her life, a performance that might very well change the course of her future. Upon reaching her room, she collapsed onto the soft, inviting bed and buried her face in her hands, questioning the strange series of events that had led her here. One less glass of wine, she mused bitterly, and perhaps she would have enjoyed a peaceful day rather than face this surreal predicament. A sharp knock at her door jolted her from her thoughts. "Elena, open the door," came Edward's crisp command from the other side. With a deep, steadying breath, she rose and opened the door to find him leaning casually against the doorframe, his appearance as impeccable as if the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a distant memory. "I trust you have fully absorbed the plan by now," he said matter-of-factly, as he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Closing the door behind him, Elena crossed her arms and challenged, "You act as though this is all so simple." Edward's response was a sharp retort. "Is it not?" he asked, his eyebrow arching in quiet incredulity. Consider this, Elena continued, her tone a mix of sarcasm and exasperation. We are nothing more than boss and assistant. We share nothing in common beyond our work. How do you expect us to convincingly portray a couple? Edward's gaze hardened as he replied, First, we must set some ground rules. You must appear comfortable and at ease around me. No forced smiles or awkward glances. He paused before adding, and you cannot afford to look troubled every time you are with me. Easy for you to say, Elena muttered under her breath, though she knew that Edward's expectations were not merely whimsical. Ignoring her protest, he continued. Furthermore, subtle gestures are paramount. Nothing overt, just a discreet touch on the shoulder, a fleeting glance that suggests intimacy, but always within the bounds of professionalism. Elena regarded him with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant amusement. I can hardly imagine greeting you without resembling a robot, she observed dryly. Edward sighed, a note of resignation in his voice. That is precisely why we must practice. Do you not agree that it is better to rehearse our act now than to risk failure in front of the investors? Rolling her eyes, yet understanding the gravity of his point, Elena finally relented. Fine, she agreed, but if this farce falls apart, it will be entirely your idea. Edward's small smirk conveyed an almost imperceptible confidence that everything would work out according to his plan. With their agreement sealed, Elena felt the full weight of her decision settle upon her. The prospect of masquerading as Edward's girlfriend for the sake of corporate negotiations was as unnerving as it was absurd. Every step she took thereafter felt laden with the dual burden of personal dignity and professional obligation. As she made her way back into the main corridors of the resort, each echo of her footsteps was a reminder that she had stepped into dangerous territory, a territory where the line between reality and performance blurred inexorably. Still, deep inside, a small, reluctant part of her wondered if perhaps this dangerous liaison might, in some inexplicable way, be the catalyst for a transformation in both her life and the fortunes of their business. In the golden haze of the late afternoon, as Elena attempted to lose herself in the quiet comfort of a well-loved book beside the resort's pool, a sudden shift in the atmosphere caused her heart to skip a beat. A long, cool shadow had fallen across the sunlit space, momentarily obscuring the shimmering water and the soft rustling of the palm fronds. Looking up slowly, Elena was met with the sight of Edward, ever the enigma, standing there with his signature aura of effortless charm. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit and a pair of dark sunglasses that barely concealed the glint of mischief in his eyes, he observed her with a faint, knowing smile. Taking a break, he inquired in a tone that was both teasing and sincere, his arms folded casually across his chest, as though he had all the time in the world. Elena, never one to be easily rattled, closed her book with deliberate calm and leaned back in her lounge chair, adopting an unhurried pose as if the moment was under her control. Is that still allowed, or is it part of your grand plan to keep me on edge at all times? She countered with a playful lilt, though a trace of exasperation undercut her light-hearted words. Edward let out a soft chuckle, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he remarked, Now, that's something rare to witness. It appears you've finally grasped the rules of our little game. A spark of challenge danced in Elena's eyes as she offered a wry smile. And it seems you frown upon anyone who outplays you, she teased back. With a deliberate ease, Edward lowered himself onto the adjacent lounge chair and loosened his tie, a subtle signal that he was prepared to drop the pretense of corporate decorum for a moment of genuine connection. I must admit, he said with a hint of admiration, I'm rather surprised that you're not as predictable as I had once assumed. Elena's eyes widened momentarily at his candor, and she felt her heartbeat quicken in response. I'm equally taken aback by the fact that you appear to be enjoying this charade as much as I am, she replied softly. The playful banter between them carried an undercurrent of something deeper. For all the practiced smiles and rehearsed gestures, there was an undeniable spark that made each touch and glance feel increasingly authentic. Just as the unspoken tension between them began to build, the sound of hurried footsteps disrupted their private moment. Elena, there you are, a voice called out, brisk and slightly breathless. It was Isabella, ever the energetic presence, rushing toward her with an air of urgency. Dinner has been moved up. We need to get ready, and fast. Isabella's tone left little room for discussion. Elena sighed, rising from her lounge chair with a reluctant grace. "Well, I suppose our conversation will have to wait," she murmured, casting one last lingering look in Edward's direction. Edward's expression was unreadable as he pulled his sunglasses back into place, his cool smile never wavering. "I can hardly wait," he remarked, as she turned and walked briskly toward her room, feeling his steady gaze tracking her every step. And in that moment, as the distance between them closed and the air seemed to hum with possibility, Elena realized that the lines between pretense and genuine emotion were blurring in a way she had never imagined. Back inside her room, Elena closed the door gently and leaned against it for a few long, contemplative seconds. She needed to collect her thoughts, reminding herself that this was all an act, a role she had been forced to play in order to secure the lucrative deal that hung in the balance. Yet, as she paced slowly across the polished wooden floor, an unsettling question began to nag at her. Why was she starting to enjoy the game so much? What had begun as nothing more than a strategic maneuver in the corporate arena now stirred emotions that felt both dangerous and exhilarating. Taking a deep breath, she approached her open suitcase and carefully selected an elegant black dress for the evening dinner. The garment was sophisticated, the very picture of understated professionalism with a touch of refined charm, a look that Edward had clearly envisioned for her. With practiced precision, she transformed herself once again, the dress serving as both armor and allure. Satisfied with her reflection, she stepped out of her room and headed toward the dining hall. The dining hall was a study in understated luxury. Sparkling chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a gentle glow over polished tables and plush chairs. A subtle blend of spices and delicate perfumes wafted through the air, mingling with the soft murmur of conversation. Scattered among the elegantly set tables were investors and influential business figures, engaged in animated discussion over gourmet dishes and fine wines. Yet as soon as Elena's eyes met Edward's across the room, it felt as though the entire atmosphere shifted. Edward was seated at a table near the center, his tailored black suit and confident smile radiating an unmistakable air of authority. But there was something different in his gaze, a softening, an almost imperceptible tenderness that Elena found both disarming and inexplicably magnetic. Before she could allow herself too much introspection, Edward was by her side in a few swift strides. "You look stunning," he said casually, as if complimenting her appearance were the most natural thing in the world. Elena blinked, momentarily surprised by the straightforward sincerity of his remark. "Thank you," she replied, her voice carrying a blend of gratitude and reserved delight. Edward leaned in slightly, and the subtle, sophisticated scent of his cologne reached her senses, enveloping her in a moment of intimacy that seemed to transcend the manufactured nature of their arrangement. "Are you ready for another round of our little game?" he asked quietly, his tone laced with both challenge and genuine curiosity. Elena offered a small, enigmatic smile in return. "Always," she replied with quiet determination, and Edward extended his arm. She accepted it, allowing him to lead her gracefully through the room as the investors exchanged knowing glances and approving smiles. Every now and then, a well-placed touch, a casual brush of his hand here, a light tap on her back there, reaffirmed the intricate dance they were performing. The dinner service proceeded with impeccable timing. Edward remained as composed as ever throughout, his every movement exuding a natural elegance. He was attentive without being overbearing, charming without seeming insincere, and his every gesture was a masterclass in the art of subtle persuasion. At one point during the celebratory toast, as the room filled with the clink of glasses and murmurs of approval, Edward leaned in close and whispered in her ear, "You've been doing an incredible job tonight." His voice was low, smooth, and imbued with an intensity that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. Caught off guard by the intimacy of his words, Elena turned her head slightly so that her lips were mere inches from his. "So have you," she murmured, her voice soft and edged with a secret vulnerability. For a fleeting moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Edward's eyes flickered briefly to her lips before locking onto her gaze once more. The charged silence between them was palpable, an unspoken promise of something that might soon break through the carefully constructed facade. Before the moment could escalate further, Charles Fairmont reappeared with his usual buoyant enthusiasm. "Well done, both of you," he declared loudly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. It looks like we'll have a signed contract by tomorrow morning." Startled by the intrusion, Elena straightened her posture and forced a polite smile, though inside, her heart raced with conflicting emotions. Edward, ever the consummate professional, smiled at Charles and remarked, "That is indeed great news. I must say, witnessing such a successful partnership, both in business and in a more personal sense, is truly inspiring." His words were smooth and measured, yet beneath the surface lay an intensity that only Elena seemed to detect. The remainder of dinner passed in a blur of structured conversation and carefully orchestrated interactions. Yet, as the evening wound down, Elena found herself needing a moment of solitude away from the relentless scrutiny and the never-ending performance. Slipping away from the crowd, she stepped out onto the resort's expansive balcony. The cool ocean breeze brushed against her skin, and the rhythmic sound of gentle waves crashing on the shore provided a welcome counterpoint to the high-stakes corporate theater inside. For several long minutes, Elena allowed herself to simply breathe, to let her thoughts wander amidst the soft murmur of the sea and the twinkling of distant city lights. Yet, despite the outward calm of the scene, her mind remained fixed on Edward. She could not deny the magnetic pull between them, the way his every glance seemed to ignite a flurry of conflicting emotions deep within her. What had begun as a carefully choreographed act was slowly, almost imperceptibly morphing into something she wasn't sure she could or even wanted to stop. Lost in her reverie, Elena barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Turning slowly, she immediately recognized the familiar figure of Edward, who had come to join her on the balcony. He leaned casually against the ornate iron railing, his eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of concern. "You seem unusually quiet tonight," he observed softly. Elena folded her arms protectively and looked at him, her eyes reflecting both apprehension and determination. "Are we taking this too far?" she asked, the question hanging heavily in the cool night air. Edward's expression shifted as he raised an eyebrow, his tone measured as he replied, "Do you mean the plan, this arrangement, or something else entirely?" His words were careful, laden with the unspoken truth of their complicated situation. Glancing away uncertainly, Elena hesitated. I'm not sure," she admitted quietly, her voice tinged with vulnerability. Edward sighed, turning slowly to face her once again. His expression grew serious, the playful spark momentarily replaced by a gravity that made the night feel infinitely more consequential. "What we're doing isn't a problem, Elena. The contract will be signed tomorrow, and then we'll both return to our normal lives," he said calmly, as though the future were as simple and inevitable as the rising sun. Elena bit her lower lip, a strange pang twisting in her chest at his words. "So, this ends tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Edward did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her intently for several long, silent seconds. Too long, perhaps, until he finally murmured, "If that's truly what you want." The simple admission sent a shock through her, for she had always believed that ending this elaborate charade was what both of them had agreed upon. And yet, in that quiet moment, as she searched Edward's eyes for reassurance, she found only uncertainty. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should she cling to the plan as originally set out, or allow herself to acknowledge that something deeper was blossoming between them? "I'm supposed to want that," she muttered to herself, the familiar words now laced with doubt. Edward's gaze, once so confidently inscrutable, now seemed to betray a hint of turmoil. "That has always been the plan," he said softly, but the timbre of his voice hinted that even he was no longer sure. For the first time, Elena saw a crack in his facade, a fleeting moment where vulnerability shone through his cool demeanor. And that, she realized with a sinking heart, changed everything. That night, Elena lay awake in her room, tossing and turning as thoughts of Edward and the rapidly evolving nature of their relationship tormented her. The contract was to be signed in the morning. The deal that had brought them together was imminent. And yet, all she felt was a strange, aching uncertainty. The man who had once seemed as distant and unapproachable as a glacier now appeared as a puzzle she was desperate to solve. Was this growing attraction real, or was it merely the result of an intricate game that had taken on a life of its own? Morning arrived quietly, with the gentle light of dawn creeping into the resort's main hall. Elena readied herself for breakfast, her thoughts still swirling with the remnants of the previous night's conversation. As she descended the grand staircase, she immediately spotted Edward seated at a table with Charles Fairmont and several other investors. His calm demeanor was unmistakable, yet the moment his eyes met hers, a silent exchange passed between them, one laden with the promise of resolution, and yet fraught with unspoken questions. Elena joined him at the table, settling into the chair beside him with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Did you sleep well?" Edward asked, in a tone that was both casual and probing. "Not really," she replied softly, keeping her voice low as if afraid that too much honesty might shatter the fragile balance of their facade. "Is there any particular reason?" she asked tentatively, though she already knew that the answer lay in the tangled emotions of the night before. Edward studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them before he added, "It will all be settled in a few hours." Deep down, Elena knew that those few hours held the weight of destiny. The final contract negotiations loomed, and the very future of their respective lives and the company depended on every carefully calculated move. As breakfast ended and the meeting convened shortly after, Edward once again took command of the discussion, his voice confident and unwavering. Elena sat at his side, her eyes never straying far from his, absorbing every subtle gesture, every nuanced glance. When the contract was finally signed and Charles Fairmont raised his glass for a celebratory toast, the atmosphere in the hall was one of triumphant finality. "I believe we made the right choice," Charles declared, his tone warm and approving. "Edward, your partnership with Elena was a key factor in this decision." Elena forced a smile, though inside she felt a hollow emptiness, a strange dissonance between the apparent success of the deal and the tumult of her emotions. The celebrations continued at the resort's bar, where laughter and clinking glasses underscored the achievement of the merger. Yet, feeling overwhelmed by the swirling mix of professional triumph and personal uncertainty, Elena quietly slipped away from the revelry. She found solace on the beach, walking slowly along the soft sand as the cool ocean breeze attempted to ease the heaviness in her chest. The rhythmic crash of the waves provided a momentary distraction, but her mind remained focused on Edward, and on the profound change that had taken root in her heart. Before she could fully lose herself in the soothing sound of the sea, she became aware of a familiar presence behind her. Turning slightly, she immediately recognized Edward, who had joined her without a word. Standing casually with his hands tucked into the pockets of his impeccably pressed trousers, his hair tousled gently by the breeze, he regarded her with a mixture of concern and quiet intensity. "Are you hiding again, Elena?" he asked softly, a note of genuine care in his voice. She sighed, a weary yet candid response escaping her lips. "I just needed a moment," she replied, her tone neither defensive nor overly apologetic. Edward nodded, his eyes fixed on the endless horizon. "What happens after all this?" Elena asked suddenly, unable to keep the question locked away any longer. His face turned solemn, and after a pause, filled with the weight of unspoken possibilities, he answered, "You go back to your life, and I go back to mine." A dry laugh escaped her, tinged with disbelief. "Just like that?" she challenged softly, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face for any sign of insincerity. Edward turned to face her fully, his expression a blend of resolve and subtle sadness. "That was the plan from the very beginning," he stated, but as his gaze lingered on her, a flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. "And you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you just going to forget all of this?" The words slipped from her lips before she could restrain them. I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. Edward stepped closer, lowering his voice to a level that was meant only for her. "Because, if we're being honest, Elena, I haven't forgotten a single thing. Not even the fact that at some point, this wasn't merely a game." His hand reached out, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that belied his earlier detachment. For a long, suspended moment, the world around them seemed to fade into insignificance as Elena searched his eyes. "If you're saying this meant nothing to you, then I can let it go," he continued gently, his words laced with both hope and resignation. Elena swallowed hard, knowing full well that she could no longer pretend that the events of the past days were simply part of a carefully constructed act. "You can't," she finally whispered, the admission heavy with both relief and fear. A small enigmatic smile spread across Edward's face, a smile that spoke of shared secrets and the dawning realization that their lives had been irrevocably changed. "Then I suppose we have a problem, Elena," he murmured, his voice soft yet insistent. "And what would that be?" she challenged, her tone mixing defiance with a tender vulnerability. Edward lowered his face closer to hers, his eyes searching hers as if seeking confirmation of an unspoken truth. "I'm not ready to pretend that this never happened," he said, with a conviction that shook her to the core. Before Elena could muster a response, the moment hung suspended between them, a fragile promise of something real and yet so uncertain. Edward's kiss had shattered the carefully constructed boundaries between pretense and truth. In that single, electrifying moment, the game was over. The cool reserve of their professional facade melted away as his lips met Elena's firmly yet unhurriedly. A kiss that seemed designed to savor every heartbeat of the revelation. It was as if time itself had paused to acknowledge that everything between them was no longer an act. Elena should have recoiled. Logic whispered that this was nothing more than a business arrangement, a meticulously choreographed performance to seal a lucrative deal. And yet, every fiber of her being rebelled against that notion. In a spontaneous surge of passion, her fingers found purchase on the collar of his crisp white shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss was warm, intense, and unlike anything she had ever experienced. In that instant, she sensed the depth of Edward's desire, as his hands slid reverently around her waist, holding her with a tenderness that promised permanence. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, Elena no longer yearned to flee. She longed to remain, to be lost in the intensity of their shared moment. But then the weight of reality crashed down. Gasping for air as she broke the kiss, Elena stepped back, her mind reeling. This shouldn't be happening," she murmured, her voice a trembling mixture of disbelief and regret. Edward kept his eyes closed for a few seconds, before slowly opening them. When he finally looked at her, there was something in his gaze she had never seen before. An unmistakable vulnerability, a raw openness that stripped away the perennial mask of the unyielding businessman. It was a look that silently pleaded for understanding, for something genuine amid the orchestrated charade. Elena shook her head as if to clear the tumult of conflicting thoughts. "This arrangement, it's just a lie, a performance," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Yet Edward reached out and ran a hand through his dark hair as if trying to collect his own disjointed thoughts. "It may have been a performance in the beginning," he said softly, "but Elena, don't ask me to pretend that it was always just that." His words, simple yet laden with emotion, made her heart race. In that moment, a tiny seed of hope sprouted within her, a desire to believe that what they shared could be real. Still, the memory of who Edward was, an implacable, powerful, and meticulously calculating businessman, flickered through her mind like a ghost. She was painfully aware of the vast chasm between their worlds. "We need to think this through," she whispered, her tone conflicted as she battled her own turbulent feelings. Edward regarded her intently for several long seconds, before his expression grew resolute. "If that's what you want," he murmured, and Elena nodded quickly, more in an attempt to convince herself than to answer him. Without another word, she turned and walked away from the moonlit beach, each step heavy with the burden of uncertainty. That night, Elena did everything in her power to avoid Edward. At the farewell dinner, she deliberately chose a seat as far away from him as possible, immersing herself in conversations with Isabella and other colleagues. Yet, each time her eyes darted to his direction, she caught sight of Edward's discreet, unwavering gaze, as if he were silently waiting for her to reconsider. Elena's inner turmoil deepened with every passing moment. She feared that if this precarious masquerade continued, and if one day she discovered that Edward's feelings did not mirror her own, the devastation would be absolute. When the dinner finally ended, she retreated to her room, collapsing onto the bed in a state of emotional exhaustion. All she wanted was to sleep, to escape the whirlwind of her heart and clear the cacophony of her thoughts. A few hours later, a soft knock on her door jolted her from a fitful slumber. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the sound and knew exactly who it must be. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she rose and opened the door to find Edward standing there. Gone was his suit jacket. He wore only a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing strong yet gentle arms. His disarming gaze, now free of any corporate reserve, met hers. "You can't run forever, Elena," he said quietly, and she felt a lump form in her throat as his words pierced the lingering silence. "I'm not running, you are," he replied with a soft defiance as he leaned casually against the doorframe. "You feel the same way I do, and you're afraid of it," he continued, his tone both accusatory and tender. Elena looked away, struggling to articulate her tumultuous feelings. "This is complicated, Edward," she managed to say, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. "It doesn't have to be," he countered, frowning slightly as he stepped closer. "We worked together," she protested, her voice barely audible. "And you're my boss. This would never work." Edward crossed his arms and leaned in even further. "What if I told you I'm willing to find a way to make it work?" His voice, now imbued with a hope that belied his previously cold exterior, sent shivers down her spine. For a moment, Elena was silent, her defenses crumbling in the face of his earnest plea. Finally, she closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "Elena, give me a chance. Just one chance," he urged softly. In that instant, the delicate dam holding back her guarded heart gave way. When she reopened her eyes, her response was nearly a whisper. One chance. The smile that spread across Edward's face was enough to convince Elena that she had lost control of the game, and that, for the first time, she didn't want to win it back. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, Elena awoke with an unfamiliar warmth pulsing through her chest. She had agreed to give Edward a chance, a decision that now echoed in her mind with silent promises and terrifying uncertainty. As she turned in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, she replayed every moment from the previous night. The kiss, his tender words, the way everything had shifted. Logically, she should have felt relief. The contract was signed, the plan was complete. She should have been able to return to her ordinary life, but, deep inside, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Her phone vibrated insistently beside her, jolting her from her reverie. Expecting a message from Isabella, Elena glanced at the screen. It was from Edward. "Meet me at the lobby in 30 minutes. We're having brunch with the Fairmonts." A deep breath steadied her nerves as she rose, preparing herself for the first time they would see each other since that fateful night. In the sleek modern lobby of the Azure Coast Resort, Elena found Edward already waiting, leaning nonchalantly against one of the designer armchairs, his eyes briefly glued to his phone. The gray suit he wore accentuated his already commanding presence. For a fleeting moment, uncertainty gripped her, but then he looked up and their eyes met. "Ready?" he asked in a calm, measured tone that belied the storm of emotions underneath. Elena mustered a tentative smile and answered, "Yes." Without a word, Edward extended his arm, inviting her to walk beside him as they headed to the restaurant where the Fairmonts awaited. Throughout the entire trip, Edward had never mentioned the previous night, not once, and that silence tormented Elena more than any harsh words could have. She yearned for him to acknowledge what had transpired, to share even a hint of his inner conflict. But Edward, ever the patient strategist, knew that Elena was still grappling with her feelings. His measured silence was both a balm and a source of deep, unspoken frustration for her. Brunch unfolded with a subdued calm. The Fairmonts celebrated the sealed contract with congenial toasts and warm smiles. Edward led the conversation with his customary confidence, sharp observations, a laugh at just the right moments, and a poise that commanded respect. Yet, in the spaces between his words, Elena caught fleeting glances that revealed a different story. Edward was watching her, not for the others, but for her, and that made her both anxious and oddly hopeful. At one point, Mrs. Fairmont, with her gentle charm, leaned in and said, "Elena, dear, it's so inspiring to see how you and Edward work together in such perfect harmony." Elena's cheeks warmed as she offered a grateful, albeit guarded, smile. "Oh, thank you," she replied, her voice soft. She could sense the unspoken admiration in his tone as Edward shifted ever so slightly beside her. "Indeed," he said, taking a careful sip of his coffee, leaving Elena to wonder whether he was still performing his role or if he was beginning to truly embrace what was unfolding between them. After brunch, as the day wore on and the resort bustled with quiet energy, Edward escorted Elena to the elevator. Standing close together, Elena crossed her arms, feeling her heart hammering in her chest. "You didn't mention anything about last night," she finally blurted out, her frustration mingled with a desperate need for clarity. Edward met her gaze calmly. "Did you want me to?" he asked, his tone even. "I don't know," she admitted, the confession bitter on her tongue. "But I expected some kind of reaction from you." He took a small step forward, closing the distance between them until their faces were only inches apart. "Elena," he said quietly, "you're already convinced. You just don't want to admit it." A shiver ran through her, and at that moment the elevator's doors slid open at her floor. With a tilted head and a soft, almost teasing remark, Edward murmured, "I'll wait for your answer." Then he walked away, leaving her standing there as if the ground beneath her had vanished. Night fell heavily over the resort, and despite the jubilant celebrations that marked the final evening of their stay, Elena's mind was a chaotic tempest of indecision. Their flight back was scheduled for the next day, and the weight of an irrevocable decision loomed ominously. Was she truly willing to risk everything on this uncertain, intoxicating new reality? Her phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from Isabella. "Let's talk about last night." Elena hesitated only for a moment before replying, "I'll meet you there." Perhaps a brief escape, a moment away from the pressure of impending decisions, would clear her foggy thoughts. At the bar, vibrant and intimate with dim lighting and the murmur of quiet conversation, Isabella was already seated, a colorful cocktail in hand. "I thought you'd bail," Isabella teased with a warm smile as Elena sat beside her. Elena forced a laugh, replying, "I just needed some time to think." Leaning in conspiratorially, Isabella asked, "Thinking about your boss looking at you like he wants to devour you?" Elena's eyes widened in mock indignation. "What? Oh, come on, don't play dumb," Isabella chided, her tone teasing. "Edward isn't exactly easy to read, but I know when someone's attracted to someone else." Elena rolled her eyes, yet the truth of her conflicted heart could not be denied. "It's not that simple," she murmured, "but it shouldn't be either." Isabella sipped her drink thoughtfully. "Elena, sometimes we make things more complicated than they need to be." As the conversation meandered between playful banter and serious reflection, Elena's thoughts returned to Edward. Moments later, she spotted him walking into the bar. At first, he avoided her gaze, but she knew the instant he noticed her presence, the measured, deliberate stride, the way he paused at the back of the room before seating himself alone. In that moment, Elena realized that if she didn't act, if she didn't make a decision soon, she would lose the chance to reclaim control of her destiny. Without hesitation, she stood up, surprising even herself. "Where are you going?" Isabella asked, concern lacing her voice. Elena only smiled, replying enigmatically, "To take care of something I should have taken care of already." Isabella laughed softly, sensing that Elena was finally ready to confront the turmoil head-on. Soon, Elena found herself at a table where Edward was holding a glass of amber whiskey. He slowly lifted his gaze as she approached, his expression both expectant and guarded. Crossing her arms in a quiet challenge, she said, "Still waiting for my answer?" He set his glass down deliberately, and Elena, summoning every ounce of courage, took a deep breath. "I don't want this to end," she declared softly. Edward's expression changed in an instant, a mixture of relief and quiet resolve washing over his face. He stood up, stepping forward to face her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice gentle yet probing. Elena nodded without hesitation. "I am," she affirmed, her voice steadier now than it had been moments before. "Then now you finally understand?" she added, though her brow furrowed in uncertainty. "Understand what?" Edward reached up slowly, his fingertips grazing her cheek with an almost reverent tenderness. "That this was never just a game," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that dispelled every lingering doubt. Before Elena could muster another word, Edward pulled her in for a kiss that was firm and resolute, one that left no space for further uncertainty. In that passionate, all-consuming moment, they had crossed an irrevocable line. Neither wanted to go back to the days of pretense. They had both chosen a truth that was now impossible to deny. As their lips met, the world around them blurred into insignificance. The kiss was laden with all the pent-up emotions of past nights and whispered promises, a union of hearts that had long been confined by duty and decorum. In the depths of that kiss, Elena felt the echo of all the sacrifices made, all the risks taken, and all the hopes kindled by a chance encounter that had grown into something far more profound. Every second of that embrace confirmed a reality that both terrified and exhilarated her. The professional veneer that had defined their every interaction was now replaced by an undeniable bond, a truth that shone like a beacon amid the chaos of corporate ambitions. And so, standing there in the half-light of a waning night, with the cool ocean breeze carrying away the remnants of old barriers, Edward and Elena embraced the uncertain future. Their journey from a calculated performance to something genuinely transformative had only just begun. In that fervent, defining kiss, they found not just the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan, but the promise of a love that might defy the rigid boundaries of their worlds. A love that, despite the risks and the uncertainties, was impossible to ignore. The cool night air carried a subtle promise as Elena felt the remnants of a whirlwind of emotions still stirring inside her. Earlier that night, in the haze of passion and unspoken confessions, Edward had kissed her, a kiss that shattered all the carefully constructed barriers of pretense. Now, as she sat on a secluded lounge chair on the beach, the rhythmic murmur of the waves seemed to echo the cadence of her racing heart. The memory of that kiss, the way his lips had explored hers with deliberate precision and unhurried intensity, played over in her mind. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment for an eternity, and in that instant, all the risks, all the doubts, melted away under the force of a passion that neither of them could have predicted. Elena knew very well that giving in to him was risky. The game they had been playing, a carefully choreographed act meant to secure a high-stakes merger, had always carried an undercurrent of danger. Yet at that moment, as Edward's lips continued their intimate conversation with hers, she no longer cared about the risks. His kiss was not a fleeting gesture. It was a promise, an exploration of a truth that had been hidden behind corporate facades and strategic smiles. Each movement of his lips was both tender and commanding, as if he were mapping out the contours of her soul with the same care he applied to his business ventures. When they finally broke apart, Elena's heart pounded fiercely against her chest. Edward's dark eyes remained locked on hers, eyes that held an emotion she could not immediately decipher. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this," he murmured, his voice low and laden with longing. The intensity in his tone made her pulse quicken even further. For a moment, she licked her lips and tried to catch her breath, the taste of his kiss still vivid on her skin. "I think I do," she replied softly, though every fiber of her being was still trying to reconcile the implications of what had just transpired. A faint smile played across Edward's features as he tenderly ran his fingertips over her face, a gesture that made her feel both cherished and exposed. "We need to talk," he said, his tone suddenly shifting from tender intimacy to serious determination. Elena nodded, a tremor in her voice betraying her inner turmoil. "Yes, but not here," she replied, aware that the privacy of the moonlit beach was the only place where they could truly unburden their hearts without the prying eyes of the corporate world. Without another word, Edward took her hand and led her away from the busy bar area toward the quiet solitude of the beach. Their footsteps on the cool sand were soft and measured, the only sounds the gentle rush of the tide and the distant calls of nightbirds. Elena took a deep, cleansing breath, allowing the fresh, salt air to fill her lungs and steady her nerves. "I'm not the kind of person who jumps into something without thinking," she began, turning to face him with earnest eyes. Edward crossed his arms and regarded her with a seriousness that belied his earlier playful nature. "I know that," he said, nodding slowly, "and neither are you." She hesitated for a second before continuing, "And yet, with you, everything feels different." A shiver ran down her spine at the vulnerability in her own confession. "Edward, if we do this, if we truly let ourselves fall, it means there will be no going back." His expression softened as he took a careful step closer, reducing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I don't want to go back," he replied firmly, his words laced with a quiet determination that resonated deep within her. Elena's mind raced with the implications of their newfound closeness. "But what about work? Everything we've built, our reputations, the merger we've been working so hard to secure?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper as the gravity of their situation pressed in on them. Edward's eyes darkened with intensity as he gently cupped her chin, tilting her face so that she was forced to meet his gaze. "If I say I'm willing to take the risk, are you?" he challenged, his tone soft but insistent. For a long moment silence reigned as Elena processed the weight of his question. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. A long, relieved exhalation escaped Edward as if he had been holding on to that answer for far too long. "Then we're in this together," he whispered, and Alina felt a spark of hope ignite amidst the chaos of uncertainty. For a few moments, neither spoke, a silence filled with the promise of a future uncharted and the bittersweet realization that nothing would ever be the same. When Edward pulled her in for another kiss, it was as if time itself had conspired to seal their fate. That kiss was different. It was a declaration, a silent vow that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The next morning, Elena awoke with a peculiar weight on her chest, a weight that felt, surprisingly, like a comfort rather than a burden. They had returned to their separate rooms after their emotional conversation on the beach, but an intangible connection now lingered in the air between them. Although their flight home was scheduled in just a few hours, Elena sensed that the real challenge was only beginning. As she methodically finished packing her suitcase, her phone rang, shattering the quiet morning routine. It was Edward. "Meet me in the lobby before we leave for the airport," his message read, his voice in the brief recorded clip low, yet carrying a nuance of something new and unspoken. And Elena took a deep breath and readied herself. Arriving at the sleek lobby of the Azure Coast Resort, she found Edward already there. He leaned casually against an elegant armchair, his eyes momentarily fixed on his phone before he looked up and smiled. Just a small, subtle smile, but one that set her heart racing. They left for the airport together, and the flight home was smooth and quiet. This time, Edward chose not to avoid sitting next to her. Instead, he sat close, allowing the silence to be filled with unspoken understanding. When they finally arrived back in the city, their driver promptly dropped them off at the towering headquarters of their company, a building bustling with employees, stacks of reports, and a full schedule of meetings. Almost immediately, the daily routine swallowed them up. In the midst of the hectic workday, Edward maintained his usual serious and professional demeanor. He participated in meetings with sharp precision and delivered confident, calculated remarks that earned him nods of approval from colleagues and superiors alike. Yet, beneath that impeccable exterior, Elena could sense subtle changes. The lingering glances he sent her during meetings, the gentle brushes of his hand when no one else was watching, and the palpable anticipation that seemed to hover between them all spoke of an inner world that was rapidly evolving. At the end of a long day, when the office was finally empty and the lights were dimmed, Edward made his way to Elena's office. He closed the door behind him, his voice quiet but triumphant as he said, "We survived the first day." Elena let out a soft chuckle, her heart lighter for a fleeting moment. "At this rate, no one will ever suspect a thing," she replied, half in jest, half in disbelief. Edward tilted his head slightly, his eyes searching hers. "And do you really want no one to suspect?" he asked, the question hanging heavily in the charged silence. Elena crossed her arms, feeling a flush of uncertainty. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, her voice tinged with apprehension. Edward took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them until they stood face to face. "I can wait," he murmured, his tone soft yet unwavering. She bit her lip, a shiver running through her, as she realized that maybe, just maybe, she no longer wanted to run from what was developing between them. For the first time in what felt like forever, she did not feel the urge to escape. Instead, she made a decision that would change everything. Stepping forward decisively, Elena closed the gap between them. "I think I already have," she said quietly, her words imbued with a newfound resolve. Edward raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Really?" he asked, and she offered a small, sincere smile. "Yes," she confirmed. In that moment, Edward leaned in slightly, and with a gentle yet electrifying caress, he kissed her once again. This kiss was unlike any before. It was laden with meaning, a silent proclamation that their lives had irrevocably merged. Their kiss was deep and unyielding, erasing every lingering doubt and hesitation. It was a kiss that spoke of risks taken, of past deceptions abandoned, and of a future that held no promise of returning to the old ways. In the wake of that passionate embrace, they lingered in the soft glow of the early morning light. Edward's hand traced a slow path down Elena's cheek, and as she gripped his shirt with an almost desperate intensity, she realized that the connection they had forged was far more real than either had dared to admit. The hours that followed were filled with whispered promises and tender declarations. Later that day, after the final formalities had been completed and the world of business resumed its relentless pace, the two retreated into a quiet corner of their office, a secret sanctuary where the boundaries between professional and personal blurred into insignificance. They spoke in hushed tones about the implications of what had transpired. "You know what this means, right?" Edward asked softly, his voice a blend of earnestness and gentle challenge. Elena smiled, her heart buoyed by the certainty of her own emotions. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of feeling swirling within her. Edward held her face in his hands with a tenderness that made her want to believe that, perhaps, there was no going back after all. "Then, there's no going back," he said, his tone final, yet hopeful. A burst of laughter, light and freeing, escaped Elena as she realized that she had never been good at reverting to her old life. "I was never good at going back," she said, her eyes sparkling with the promise of something new. Edward's expression softened, and for a brief moment, the weight of the past few days lifted from her shoulders. They agreed to discuss how to manage the inevitable complexities of mixing work and personal life, a conversation that was both practical and deeply personal. "We can't let this affect the company," Elena insisted, her pragmatic side emerging even as her heart soared. "But I don't want to hide what we have," Edward replied firmly. They talked quietly for a while longer, deciding to keep their burgeoning relationship under wraps at least for the time being, so as not to disrupt the delicate balance of their professional lives. As the office slowly emptied and night fell, Edward retrieved his jacket and offered to drive Elena home. Despite her initial protest, she allowed him to escort her, and together they left the building under the soft glow of streetlights. In the car, as they drove through the quiet, brightly lit streets of the city, Edward asked, "What are you thinking about?" Elena sighed. "This is a huge risk, but it feels like something I've been waiting for." Edward smiled gently. "You've taken risks with me before, none quite like this," he said. Then, stopping at a red light, he turned to her and asked, "Elena, do you trust me?" After a long, searching moment, she whispered yes, and with that simple word, the bond between them was sealed. At her apartment, as they said their goodbyes, and Edward's eyes lingered on hers in a silent farewell, Elena felt that all the risks and uncertainties had been worth it. Over the following days, life resumed its relentless pace, but something fundamental had shifted. In the midst of the daily grind, every lingering glance, every subtle touch, exchanged when no one was looking, became a reminder of the truth that had emerged. At the end of the day, when the office lights dimmed and the corridors fell silent, Edward would often appear in Elena's office with a small, knowing smile, a quiet promise that they had both changed and that nothing would ever be quite the same. That evening, as they finally closed the chapter on the business day, Edward once again crossed the invisible line that had separated them for so long. He stepped into Elena's office and with a soft murmur said, "We survived the first day." Elena couldn't help but chuckle softly in reply, "At this rate, no one will ever suspect a thing." His eyes, however, held a glimmer of something deeper, a promise that went beyond the confines of the business world. In that charged atmosphere, they both realized that their journey was only just beginning. Later, after the office had emptied and the city lights cast long shadows over the empty corridors, Edward gently led Elena to the parking garage. As they walked together side by side, she knew that this new chapter would be fraught with challenges, but also with the promise of something real and transformative. The decision had been made, and neither of them was willing to run anymore. Standing at the threshold of a new day, Elena finally embraced the truth that had been hiding behind layers of pretense. In Edward's eyes, in the quiet moments shared over coffee in the early morning light, and in the tender farewell of each passing day, she found the courage to admit that their connection was no longer a game. It was real. And for the first time in her life, Elena felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The night had deepened into a gentle mystery as Elena sat in quiet contemplation, her mind still swirling with the wind of emotions that had carried her through the day. She already knew that giving in to Edward was risky, even as every fiber of her being ached with longing. In that vulnerable moment, with the cool ocean breeze teasing the edges of her resolve, she recalled all that had led them to this precipice. Every clandestine touch, every whispered promise in the dead of night, had gradually eroded the barriers between their carefully maintained facades. Now, as she sat on the edge of the soft sand, gazing out at the infinite expanse of the darkened sea, Elena recognized that she no longer cared about the risks. Her heart had begun to speak a language that defied corporate logic. Earlier, the memory of their passionate kiss still echoed in her mind. Edward's lips had met hers with a precision that was both unhurried and fierce, as if he had been waiting his entire life for that moment. His kiss had been an unspoken admission that the game was finally over. There were no more masks, no more pretenses. In that heated exchange, all that remained was the raw truth of their emotion. His lips had explored hers with a certainty that made her pulse race, and for a long, breathless moment, the world around them had ceased to exist. When they pulled apart, Elena felt her heart pounding relentlessly in her chest. Edward's dark eyes remained locked on hers, an intensity there that made her wonder what secrets lay behind them. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this," he had murmured, his voice a low confession, laden with longing. Elena, still catching her breath, had managed a soft reply, "I think I do." Now, as the memory of that kiss mingled with the cool night air, Elena's mind churned with 1,000 thoughts. She remembered the way Edward's fingertips had traced tender lines along her face, the way he had gently cradled her emotions as if afraid that they might shatter at the slightest misstep. And yet, despite the passion that had overtaken them, a small part of her had been gripped by fear. The very act of surrendering to him was a leap into an uncertain future, a future where the balance between work and love could shatter all that they had built. But at that moment, standing on the threshold of possibility, she had chosen to ignore those risks. Edward's kiss had dissolved her doubts like sugar in warm tea. As they slowly separated that night on the beach, Edward had taken her hand and led her away from the crowded bar. They walked in silence under a sky dusted with stars, their footsteps leaving fleeting imprints in the soft sand. The night seemed to cradle them in its quiet embrace as they reached a secluded spot where the only sound was the gentle roll of the waves. Elena's heart pounded as she inhaled the bracing sea air, letting it wash over her and steady her nerves. "I'm not the kind of person who jumps into something without thinking," she had confessed softly as she turned to face him. Edward had crossed his arms, his expression serious yet understanding, and replied, "I know that, and neither are you." After a pause heavy with unspoken truths, she had continued, "And yet, with you, everything feels so different." A shiver had run down her spine at the sincerity in her own words. Edward's gaze had softened. "If we do this, if we truly let ourselves fall, there's no going back," he had said, with a mix of determination and tenderness. "I don't want to go back," he added, stepping closer until the cool night air seemed to shimmer around them. Elena's heart had fluttered as she considered the implications. "But what about work? Everything we've built," she had whispered, knowing that their secret liaison was bound to complicate the high-stakes merger and the reputations they guarded so fiercely. Edward had cupped her chin gently, tilting her face upward so that their eyes met in a gaze that left no room for doubt. "If I say I'm willing to take the risk, are you?" he had asked, his voice low and earnest. For a long, suspended moment, silence had stretched between them until Elena, with a trembling resolve, had slowly nodded. "Yes," she had murmured, and in that single word lay the promise of a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Then we're in this together," he had declared softly. In that moment, as he pulled her into another kiss, a kiss that was deep and resolute, the world had shifted irrevocably. There were no more games. Only the raw, unfiltered truth of their passion remained. The following morning, Elena awoke with a sensation unlike any she had ever known. It was a good weight on her chest, a mix of relief, anticipation, and the lingering echo of Edward's kiss. Their separate rooms had once again become their sanctuaries, but the connection between them now hung palpably in the air. Their flight home was only a few hours away, and Elena knew that when they returned to the familiar chaos of work, the delicate balance they had so painstakingly maintained would be challenged anew. As she finished packing her suitcase, her phone vibrated, breaking the stillness of the early morning. It was Edward. "Meet me in the lobby before we leave for the airport." His message read in a calm, steady tone that carried something more than routine business. Elena took a deep breath and made her way to the modern glass-fronted lobby of the Azure Coast Resort. There she found Edward waiting, leaning casually against a sleek designer armchair, his eyes briefly fixed on his phone before he looked up and smiled. His smile was small and subtle, yet it made her heart race. They left for the airport together, and the flight was filled with a quiet intimacy that spoke volumes in its silence. Edward chose not to sit apart. He sat close, allowing every moment to build unspoken meaning. When they arrived in the city, the driver deposited them at the towering headquarters of their company, a place where employees bustled about with reports in hand and the weight of expectations was palpable. The workday began as usual, with Edward donning his serious, meticulous demeanor and Elena moving with determined efficiency. Yet amid the flurry of meetings, emails, and presentations, Elena could feel that something had changed irrevocably. Every lingering glance from Edward, every subtle brush of his hand when they thought no one was watching, resonated with the truth of their new bond. At the end of the day, after the office lights had dimmed and the corridors had fallen silent, Edward stepped into Elena's office. He closed the door gently behind him and said, "We survived the first day." Elena chuckled softly, her heart buoyed by the simple truth of his words. "At this rate, no one will ever suspect a thing," she replied, though her mind was far from at ease. Edward tilted his head slightly, his eyes searching hers. "And do you really want no one to suspect?" he asked softly, almost as a challenge. Elena crossed her arms, uncertainty mingling with a newfound resolve. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. Edward took a slow step forward, closing the distance until their faces were inches apart. "I can wait," he murmured, his tone both gentle and insistent. She bit her lip as she realized that she might no longer want to run from these feelings. With quiet determination, Elena stepped forward and said, "I think I already have." Edward raised an eyebrow, his gaze filled with both disbelief and hope. "Really?" he asked, and she managed a small, sincere smile. "Yes," she confirmed. At that moment, Edward leaned in once more. With a tenderness that defied the ruthless precision of his everyday persona, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. This kiss, full of all the longing, risk, and unspoken promises, was not simply a continuation of their earlier passion. It was a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. Their lips met with a fervor that sealed their fate, as if they had both finally surrendered to the undeniable truth of their connection. Afterwards, as they slowly pulled apart, Edward rested his forehead against hers and asked quietly, "You know what this means, right?" Elena smiled softly, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and joy. "Yes," she whispered. Edward's gentle touch lingered on her cheek as he added, "Then there's no going back." A laugh bubbled from Elena, a light, freeing sound that carried away the tension of the past days. "I was never good at going back," she admitted, and in that moment, both realized that the time for running had long passed. In the weeks that followed, the romance between Elena and Edward blossomed rapidly. What had once been a game of teasing and calculated challenges evolved into something much bigger, something profoundly real. At the office, they continued to play their parts. Edward remained the demanding, meticulous boss, and Elena the efficient, determined assistant. Yet behind the scenes, in the quiet intervals between meetings and on business trips, their stolen glances and subtle touches narrated a secret story of their burgeoning love. Their days were filled with intense work and corporate strategies, but their nights belonged solely to them. When they weren't traveling for work, they found solace in each other's company in the simplest and most authentic ways. They shared cozy dinners at Elena's modest apartment, where Edward, despite his insistence that he could cook, always ended up ordering gourmet takeout instead. They escaped on weekends to a charming country house far from the relentless pace of the city, where they could laugh freely and share secrets that they had kept hidden for too long. Every day spent by Edward's side only confirmed what Elena had long suspected. She was in love, and to her astonishment, so was he. One evening, after a long, exhausting day at the office, Elena and Edward found themselves curled up together on the comfortable couch in her living room. Elena wore a soft, well-worn sweatshirt, and Edward had traded his usual power suit for a casual t-shirt and pajama pants, a side of him that the world rarely saw. "You never thought we'd end up like this, did you?" Elena asked, nestled against his chest as if seeking refuge from the harshness of their dual lives. Edward chuckled, a sound that was both warm and genuine. "Not even in my most unlikely calculations," he replied. Elena lifted her head and smiled, her heart full of unspoken questions. "So, tell me, when did you realize you were in love with me?" she inquired softly. Edward frowned for a moment, as if analytically sifting through his memories. "I think it was that night at the resort," he began slowly, "when you stumbled into my room, completely out of sorts, and even though you were a bit drunk, you snored right next to me." Elena pulled away slightly, feigning shock. "I do not snore often," she protested, her tone playful yet firm. Edward's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Oh, you do, you liar. Okay, maybe just a little," he teased. Elena crossed her arms and pretended to be offended, but soon she laughed along with him, their shared humor dissolving any lingering formality. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, Edward took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "I think I knew I loved you long before that," he confessed, his voice softening with sincerity. "Maybe from the moment I realized you weren't afraid to challenge me." Elena's heart raced as she absorbed his words. "But," she began, only for him to gently place a finger over her lips. "And that's why I planned something special for tonight," he murmured, his eyes darkening with meaning. Elena blinked in confusion. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, in a dramatic yet tender gesture, Edward slowly sank to one knee. Elena's world seemed to stop as she covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Edward, what are you?" she managed to say before he pulled something from his pocket. In his hand was a ring that, upon closer inspection, appeared entirely crooked, as if it had been haphazardly made. Elena frowned, trying to understand the intent behind this bizarre token. "Is that a ring, or did you try to make an abstract sculpture?" she teased gently. Edward sighed dramatically. "This is what happens when you try to make your own wedding ring," he explained. "I nearly lost a finger in the process." Elena laughed so hard she had to lean against the couch for support. "Edward, you're a millionaire. You could have bought the most perfect ring in the world," he smiled, his expression softening. "I wanted it to be unique, just like us." Tears filled Elena's eyes as she realized the depth of his sincerity. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Edward squeezed her hand gently. "Elena, you've always challenged me, annoyed me, made me laugh, and made me feel things I never thought possible. I know that work and love aren't supposed to mix, but we've never followed the rules anyway, so how about we break one more?" He took a deep breath and looked straight into her eyes. "Will you marry me?" Elena's heart pounded as she swallowed hard. Tears threatened to spill over, yet she felt an overwhelming joy unlike anything she had known. "I want to say yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Gently, she took the crooked ring from his hand and slid it onto her finger. "But can we at least buy a ring that doesn't look like it got run over?" she joked, eliciting a hearty laugh from Edward. "So, that's a yes?" he asked, his smile broadening. "Yes, you crazy man," she replied, and they kissed once more, sealing their promise to one another. In the weeks that followed, the wedding day arrived like a dream woven from passion and possibility. The ceremony took place at a picturesque winery where string lights hung between ancient trees and a rustic altar was adorned with white flowers. Elena looked stunning in a light, elegant dress that was simple yet breathtakingly beautiful, a reflection of her true self, unburdened by the constraints of elaborate expectation. Edward, always the devoted partner, had insisted that she wear exactly what made her feel the most authentic. As she walked down the aisle, her heart raced at the sight of Edward waiting for her, his eyes brimming with unwavering devotion. He stood there in a perfectly tailored black suit, his gaze fixed on her as if she were the only person in the world. When Elena finally reached him, Edward leaned in close and whispered, "You look beautiful." Elena's smile radiated pure joy as she replied, And you look like someone who has finally accepted that he can't control everything." Edward chuckled softly. "With you, I never could." The officiant began the ceremony, yet for Elena and Edward it felt as though they were the only two souls present. When it came time for the vows, Edward took her hand, and with a steady voice filled with raw emotion, said, "Elena, you are the person who challenged everything I thought I knew about love. You taught me that life is not merely about work, contracts, and numbers. With you, I have learned that the unexpected is often the best part of life. Today, in front of our closest friends and family, I promise to keep breaking the rules by your side. I promise to love you through every storm and every calm, and I promise never to try making a ring by myself again." Laughter filled the air as guests joined in the merriment. Wiping away a joyful tear, Elena responded, "Edward, I never imagined that my cold and controlling boss would become the love of my life. You challenge me, you frustrate me, and yet you make me happier than I ever thought possible. I promise to love you, even when you grumble about late reports, even when you insist you know how to cook, and especially when you forget to remove the lid from your coffee and scald yourself." The officiant smiled broadly and announced, "You may kiss the bride." Without hesitation, Edward cupped Elena's face and kissed her as if it were the very first time, as if it were the last, and as if it were forever. The guests cheered, and as they pulled apart, Elena whispered softly, "We're really married." Edward's eyes sparkled with mischief as he held her hand close and said, "This is the best contract I've ever signed." Their kiss that day was more than a symbol. It was a promise that their love was not a game, but a commitment that would endure. In the days and months that followed, the romance between Elena and Edward blossomed into something extraordinary. Though they continued to keep their relationship discreet at the office, every exchanged glance and every subtle touch told the truth behind closed doors. Even as they resumed their professional roles, their love seeped into the spaces between meetings and long business trips, where cozy dinners at Elena's apartment, spontaneous weekend getaways, and quiet, stolen moments began to define their new reality. On quiet evenings when the world outside seemed to pause, Elena and Edward would curl up together on the couch for long late-night conversations. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and the ways in which they had transformed one another. "You know," Edward would say softly as they sat entwined in comfortable silence, "I never thought that a single night could change everything." And Elena, with her eyes shining with both mischief and sincerity, would simply smile, knowing that their journey had only just begun. At times, Elena would find herself lost in thought, wondering how it was that their improbable love story had unfolded from a business arrangement into a life-altering romance. In those moments she would recall the tender crooked ring that Edward had made, a symbol of imperfection and authenticity that perfectly encapsulated their relationship. Their love was messy and unpredictable, yet it was beautiful in its raw, unguarded form. One quiet evening as they sat together on the couch in their small, sunlit living room, Elena confided, "I used to think that everything had to be controlled, every detail, every plan. But with you, I've learned that sometimes the best things in life are the ones that happen when we let go." Edward smiled gently and replied, "And you, Elena, have taught me that true strength lies not in control, but in vulnerability. With you I feel more alive than I ever have." Their voices mingled with the soft hum of the night, and in that moment, they both understood that their love was not just a fleeting spark. It was a flame that would guide them through every dark hour. In the days that followed, as they navigated the delicate balance of their professional lives and their secret romance, Elena and Edward discovered that the real challenge was not in maintaining appearances, but in embracing the truth of their feelings. Every morning, as they donned their professional attire and stepped into a world that demanded precision and perfection, they carried with them the quiet knowledge of the love they had forged. And every night, as they retreated into their private sanctuary, they celebrated the small moments of tenderness. A shared cup of coffee in the early morning light, a lingering touch on a busy day, or a stolen kiss in a quiet corridor. Their journey was far from conventional, but it was theirs. The contract that had once seemed so paramount had become a mere backdrop to the unfolding narrative of their hearts. And as they faced the future together, Elena knew one undeniable truth. She was exactly where she was meant to be, with a man who had challenged her, changed her, and ultimately shown her the beauty of living authentically. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of love, transformation, and breaking the rules. From a world where business was everything, to a heart-opening romance that defied expectations, Elena and Edward's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most beautiful rewards. Their journey shows that being true to yourself, even when it means stepping outside the norm, can change your life forever. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about their story? Did you believe love can truly conquer all, even in the most unexpected places? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional stories like this. Your feedback means the world to us.